In 1789, Paris was a city divided, fractured by hunger, class, and king. Marie Antoinette lived in gilded splendor in one corner, while around her 2 million souls struggled through the day in poverty. It was a powder keg of discontent waiting for a match. That same year, the American colonies rang in their new independence with fireworks over New York Harbor. They might have been celebrating France's debts, because without French aid, George Washington's ragtag army would never have made it. Yet in Paris, news of America's revolution barely registered. People had enough trouble remembering what they ate the night before, let alone worrying about a fight across the sea. Your typical Parisian woke before dawn, if he or she could call themselves lucky. The working poor had long since risen to take up their familiar spots in the shops, factories, and fields that surrounded the city. Meanwhile, in the better neighborhoods, ladies in quilted nightcaps yawned over their porcelain demitasse, pretending they weren't listening as servants gossiped about the latest decrees from Versailles. These scenes of bourgeois domesticity played out across the city every morning like clockwork, but they were ticking away on borrowed time. As the years went on, bread got scarcer and riots became commonplace. Whispers turned into shouts, and even the great silences between neighbors became charged with the threat of violence. In the suburbs, men, women, and children scrounged for roots and grass to make gruel. At midday, the nobles gathered in the Tuileries garden. While the masses packed into cafes and taverns, anyone with money tried to look busy. So as not to attract thieves, merchants shuttered their doors and hid their wares from looters. And in the evenings, the aristocracy retreated behind locked gates and bolted windows, sipping sweet petits vangs and eating cold dinners by candlelight. Occasionally, the rumble of discontent spilled into the streets, rattling the windows of the rich. Then the sun went down again, and the city held its breath until the next morning. Did you ever feel like the walls of your home were closing in? That claustrophobia must have been nothing compared to the Parisians, who lived in permanent fear of their own revolutionaries. It was hot cockle summer in Paris. Of course, it always felt like it was going to be hot cockle summer, but this year it was even hotter than usual. It was also threatening to be a hungrier than usual summer, too, thanks to the heat ruining the already sparse crops. On July, it seemed like things couldn't get any worse. That day, the king announced that he and his ministers would take up residence in the palace of the Tuileries instead of Versailles, hoping that would bring him closer to the people and earn him some much-needed goodwill. Instead, it only highlighted the difference between the haves and the have-nots. That night, an anonymous pamphlet appeared, calling for a popular militia to protect Paris from attack. It wasn't clear what attacks, but everyone assumed it meant the royal troops stationed outside the city. The pamphlet drifted from person to person at first, then began showing up in print. Rumors spread like disease. First, it was said that the king intended to disarm the citizens. Then word got around that he wanted to arrest the leaders of the militia. Finally, the whole affair culminated in a rumor that the royal troops would march into Paris that night and slaughter everyone in the streets. People who had been angry about high taxes and bread prices suddenly found themselves united against a common enemy, the king. And it didn't matter that these rumors were completely false. By midnight, 10,000 angry Parisians had gathered at the Bastille, a hulking medieval fortress and prison that had become the symbol of royal tyranny. You may have heard about storming the Bastille, but have you ever wondered what was actually inside? Not much. It was mostly just old gunpowder stores, crumbling ruins, and a few weapons left over from Napoleon's wars. A group of men armed themselves with whatever they could find and prepared to defend the building against the coming royal troops, except the royal troops never showed up. All that came were 2 frightened soldiers and a deputy jailer. By the time the crowd realized there was no real reason to storm the place, it was too late. The deputy jailer was dead, and 2 of the men defending the Bastille had been killed. Still, the prisoners should have been pretty grateful. Their cells were opened, and the 700 of them inside were set free. After all that, though, the rioters still needed something to show for their night's work. So they marched on the nearby Hotel des Invalides, disarmed the soldiers stationed there, and took 34 cannons to parade around the city, proving that they, the people, had taken control. No one could remember exactly who made the decision to seize the Bastille, who cut the locks on the prisoners' cells, or who led the charge on the invalids. There was no mastermind, only a simmering anger that boiled over when the rumors started spreading. And yet this single night changed everything. King Louis XVI was forced to don the costume of Citizen Louis and accept the tricolor flag of the revolution. But many of the aristocrats who decorated the streets of Paris with blood and guillotines the following years had no idea why. See, most of them never got the memo. Even after the fall of the Bastille, the upper classes carried on as normal. For them, the revolution was something distant and abstract, the sort of thing that happened to other people. The quietest of these aristocrats was a young lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, whose name we know today because he was one of the main architects of the revolution. Or was he? Well, yes, but not the Robespierre of legend, at least not yet. Most of the time, Robespierre was nervous. He suffered from crippling shyness and worried that his nose was too big, or that people would find out he was unfaithful to his wife. When he argued before the tribunal, though, he commanded such authority that the people called him the Incorruptible. What was this quiet, timid man doing leading the most ruthless government in human history? That's what we'll find out right after. Maximilien Robespierre was born in 1758, the son of a minor noble. His father died when he was young, leaving his mother and his 8 siblings penniless. From an early age, Robespierre exhibited remarkable self-discipline, rising early, exercising, and maintaining a strict schedule. As an adult, he became a successful lawyer, which put him in contact with the intellectual elite of Paris. Here, Robespierre discovered his voice and developed a radical political conscience. He believed passionately in natural rights and equality before the law, and he worked tirelessly in defense of the poor. But for all his courage in the courtroom, Robespierre was a timid soul. He had been an awkward teenager with severe acne, and when he reached adulthood, he compensated for his appearance with his manner. He dressed well, cultivated an air of importance, and used long, florid language whenever possible. But underneath that carefully constructed facade beat the heart of a scared little boy. He wrote to his sister once, "I am tormented by the remembrance of my childhood." Years later, he confided to his friend Colot Derboy, "If my fellow citizens knew how frightened I am, they would no longer trust me with important business." One of the few people who saw past Robespierre's bravado was his wife, Charlotte de Valois, a former actress. She married him knowing full well that he wasn't much of a man's man. She kept up with his schedule, doted on his aging mother, and took care of his health and finances. Without Charlotte, Robespierre might have withered and died. Was, after all, the kind of guy who wrote love letters to inanimate objects like fireplaces and statues. But she was also no angel. Robespierre thought the world of her, but she gambled away their money and had several abortions. Poor Maximilien never noticed or chose to ignore it. Either way, he was blinded to his wife's flaws, just as he would soon be blinded to the consequences of his actions. His heady mix of social conscience and morbid fear of losing face propelled him to the center of the revolution. And along the way, he turned his friends into enemies and his admirers into victims. For more tales of brave souls in a scary world, check out our series on surviving the plague. You'll meet monks who partied too hard, an alchemist who tried to poison everyone in London. You probably wouldn't enjoy life in revolutionary Paris, at least according to my first historically accurate Parisian whose identity I'm protecting for their safety. If you don't love shoving elbow to elbow with thousands of people, hate standing in lines, have a preference for food and disliking uncertainty, I would suggest staying away from Paris, or the rest of France. But of course, that's just my opinion. So why don't you ask someone else? How did everyday citizens experience the French Revolution? Well, let's ask someone else. Welcome to the series where we talk to real people in historical reenactment and living history settings. In this episode, we'll be talking to people from the French Revolution at the Living History Encampment at Shea Body in Indiana. Before we jump into it, I'd like to extend a big thank you to the people who helped make this episode possible. As always, our first person is a regular viewer of the channel, and we've actually met before. So I won't bother you with pleasantries. Instead, I'll just dive right into my questions. Tell me about yourself. Where in France would you have lived during the Revolution? I would have lived in Paris. I was born in Paris in 1778. I grew up in the Marais district. The Marais district was one of the poorer sections of Paris, but it was a very ethnic area. There were lots of Jewish people, Italian people, Spanish people, so there was always a lot going on. That was the good part of it. The bad part was, it was very, very poor. and there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity. So most people who lived there had small businesses. They were artisans, tradesmen, shopkeepers. Some of them were wealthy merchants. But really the bulk of the population were working people, poor people trying to get by. Did you witness any major events during the Revolution? Oh yes. The storm of the Tuileries and the storming of the Bastille were both very close by my house. So those were exciting times. I remember watching the procession of the king and his family going from the Tuileries Palace to the temple. That was when I realized this is getting serious and I should probably get out of town. What was your general attitude towards the revolution? At first I thought it was pretty exciting. We got to watch the king being dragged through the streets. We could throw rotten fruit at him. It was kind of fun. I liked the idea that everybody was equal and that maybe our situation would improve. Unfortunately, it didn't. What were the biggest problems facing the average citizen during the revolution? I think the biggest problem was food. There was never enough food and it was very expensive. People were starving. Poverty was rampant. There was no help for poor people, and everyone was wondering if they were going to get pulled into the revolution and lose their head. Were you ever in danger during the revolution? Yes. I was in Paris when Danton and Robespierre were executed. My husband was arrested several times on suspicion of being an aristocrat because he looked like one. So that was scary. We weren't allowed to leave Paris. People were getting killed left and right, so that was dangerous. And also, when Marat was assassinated, there were just hordes of people looking for the assassin. And it was rumored that he had accomplices, so we were afraid that people would come to our house and look for accomplices. Our next interviewee is quite literally the embodiment of the commoner turned revolutionary. Originally hailing from Brittany, this reenactor moved to Paris to work as a shoemaker, finding himself right in the middle of the revolution. Over time, he went from reluctant participant to passionate revolutionary, and eventually found himself caught up in the reign of terror. Now, I'm not going to reveal the outcome of this story just yet, but let's see how this Parisian experienced the revolution. Tell me about yourself. I'm a simple guy from Brittany. I'm a soldier, actually. Used to be a soldier. I was wounded and then I came to Paris to try and make a living as a shoemaker. Who were you? I was a corporal in the Brittany regiment, but after I was wounded at the Siege of the Diamond, I decided that I didn't want to do that anymore. And I came to Paris to set up a workshop to be a shoemaker. What was life like in Paris for you? Difficult. Very difficult. I'm not cut out for city life, especially without having enough money to live comfortably. It was hard to find work. It was hard to find materials, and it was hard to make ends meet. You know, I guess you could say, I'm a provincial guy. I'm from the country. I'm not cut out for the city life. This is what brought on the revolution for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I was hungry. Everyone was hungry. Things had gotten so bad, and I saw what was going on in the streets, and I said, I have to get involved. I can't just stand by and watch. I have to do something. What was your general attitude towards the revolution? I was cautiously optimistic. I saw that there was a need for change, definitely. The old regime had been oppressive, and it wasn't good. And I wanted to see things improve for myself and for my family. And so I joined in with the revolution. But I was also fearful. I knew that this could turn ugly. And I saw violence in the streets, and I saw people being pulled into the guillotine. And I knew this wasn't going to end well. And so I was sort of hoping that it would end before I got dragged into it. But unfortunately it didn't. And I ended up being arrested and sent to the guillotine myself. For our final interview, I sat down with a middle-aged woman who ran a popular bakery in the Saint Antoine area of Paris as a middle-class shopkeeper. She felt the pressures of the revolution keenly, especially when her son was accused of hoarding and disappeared one day, leaving only a note behind saying he would be back soon. Despite the disruption caused by the revolutionaries, she still supported the revolution and its goals, even as she wondered where her son had gone. Tell me about yourself. I am a baker. I own this little bakery here. I have 2 sons. One is a baker like me. The other one is older. He's been apprenticed out. And he works for a banker. He helps the banker with his accounts. My sons are fine boys. They work hard. They try to help me out in the shop. What is life like in Paris? Hard. I don't understand these revolutionaries. They're always yelling, always causing trouble, always marching on the Tuileries. They demand bread from me. They demand money from me. They demand flour. They demand sugar. And I tell them, I don't have it. Can't afford it. And they yell at me and they say I'm hoarding, and I say I'm not. Swear to God, I don't have anything to give you. And they don't believe me. Your son, Pierre, left. Is he coming back anytime soon? Pierre. Yes, Pierre. He had to leave. They accused him of hoarding. They said he was taking money from people and not giving them bread. And I told them he doesn't do that. He doesn't hoard. I don't hoard. But they didn't listen. And they said he had to leave town, and so he left. He put a little note under the door, said he was sorry, and he'd be back as soon as he could. But he hasn't come back yet. I miss my son. I worry about my son. Are you worried that he's in danger? Yes. The baker on the corner, he talked to me today, says that the revolutionaries, they're rounding people up. They're taking them to the guillotine. People who don't have anything, they're taking them anyway. They say that the baker is next, and I'm afraid. One day in revolutionary Paris. I hope you enjoyed hearing about one day in the life of various Parisians during the revolution. Did you notice the parallel between this revolution and others we've covered in the past? People aren't usually happy during revolutions, even if they support them. This is a special episode on one of history's most reviled figures. Now, before we begin, a trigger warning for some viewers. This episode contains references to violence and upsetting historical events. He insisted on wearing white socks, even though his family struggled financially and complained bitterly when he was forced to walk barefoot. But despite these quirks, young Max was widely regarded as a sweet-tempered child. And as he grew up, his personality remained largely unchanged. Here, among the cream of the nation's youth, he distinguished himself as an avid student, particularly excelling in rhetoric and politics. He gained a reputation for defending the poor, downtrodden, or anyone who couldn't afford to pay the exorbitant fees of the city's top lawyers. Throughout his career, Robespierre fought against arbitrary punishment and championed the rights of the accused. When the governor refused, the crowd seized the fortress and executed him along with several others. In September of 1789, he was elected as a delegate to the National Assembly, where he advocated for greater political rights and freedoms for the French people. His speeches were met with polite applause, but he was regarded primarily as a country lawyer with naive ideas about politics. However, as the revolution progressed, and the situation in Paris grew increasingly chaotic, Robespierre's fortunes changed dramatically. However, as the threat of invasion diminished, Robespierre turned the committee's attention to internal threats, namely those who opposed the revolution or who were suspected of being loyalists or traitors. This shift in focus was motivated by Robespierre's belief that the revolution was in danger of stalling or even being reversed. He feared that the middle-class liberals who dominated the National Convention were too afraid to take decisive action against the enemies of the revolution. And so he sought to use the committee to purge the government of moderates and replace them with more radical revolutionaries. Firstly, the sheer scale of the atrocities committed during the Reign of Terror is staggering. Estimates suggest that between 1793 and 1794, around 40,000 people were executed by the guillotine in France. Secondly, Robespierre's methods were often cruel and inhumane. He oversaw the torture and execution of countless innocent people, including many who had done nothing to oppose the revolution. Thirdly, Robespierre's hypocrisy is also evident in his treatment of those close to him. While he preached virtue and moderation, he was willing to sacrifice anyone who stood in his way, including his own friends and allies. Lastly, Robespierre's legacy has been further tarnished by the fact that he was ultimately unsuccessful in achieving his goals. The French Revolution descended into chaos and violence following his execution and the subsequent Napoleonic era. The storming of the Bastille marked the beginning of the French Revolution, a period of radical political and social upheaval in France that lasted nearly a decade. What do you think? Do you find this video insightful? Or perhaps it changed your perspective on this historical figure? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Additionally, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe for more engaging historical tales. Thanks for watching. He used the committee's power to arrest and execute suspected enemies of the revolution, as well as to suppress newspapers and other forms of dissent. One of the most infamous acts of the Committee of Public Safety was the introduction of the Law of 22 Prairial, which allowed for the summary execution of suspected enemies of the state without a trial. However, the charges against him were too great, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death. As the blade fell, ending Robespierre's life, It also brought an end to the Reign of Terror and the most radical phase of the French Revolution. This law, along with Robespierre's other measures to suppress dissent, resulted in the execution of thousands of French citizens, including many members of the Girondin political party, which opposed Robespierre's policies. But the French army was ill-prepared for war and suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Prussians. However, as the revolution entered its final stages, Robespierre's allies began to turn against him. They feared that he was becoming too powerful and that he would eventually seize control of France entirely. On July 9, 1794, Robespierre was arrested and sent to the guillotine. The revolutionary tribunal that had become a symbol of the Reign of Terror. As news of the defeat spread, Parisians grew increasingly anxious about the future of the revolution and the fate of France as a whole. In response, a group of radical revolutionaries known as the Jacobins seized the Tuileries Palace and forced the royal family to flee to the Legislative Assembly. There, the Jacobins, led by Robespierre, demanded the establishment of a republic and the abolition of the monarchy. While Robespierre had previously supported the rights of the monarchy, he ultimately sided with the Jacobins, arguing that the king's flight demonstrated his commitment to tyranny and oppression. The Legislative Assembly voted to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic, and Robespierre was hailed as a hero of the revolution. During this time, the French people overthrew the monarchy, established a republic, and experienced unprecedented levels of violence and instability. With the king deposed and France plunged into chaos, the country was vulnerable to attack from its foreign enemies. Established in April of 1793, the committee was chaired by two men, Jean-Lambert Tallien and Georges Couthon, but soon became dominated by Robespierre and his allies. And as if by some dark irony, it was Robespierre's role as leader of the revolution that made him the target of those who sought to bring France to its knees. One such case involved a farmer charged with raping a young woman. Despite overwhelming evidence of his client's guilt, Robespierre successfully argued that the accuser had fabricated the crime out of revenge. It was this case that fully revealed Robespierre's character, his unshakable sense of justice, and unwavering commitment to the law. Though his classmates remembered him as pale, bookish, and painfully serious, he earned their respect for his intelligence. Robespierre yearned to serve France directly, to champion its people on a larger stage. And with the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789, his opportunity finally presented itself. And while he never quite fit in, he did make one true friend, the Marquis de Condorcet, who was as charming and effervescent as Robespierre was somber. The pair were an unlikely duo, but their friendship lasted decades. He had few close friends, liked children and animals, and possessed a strong sense of civic duty. While he was known to argue with his own siblings, he was a defender of those weaker than himself. And during the turbulent days of the Revolution, he took in an orphaned nephew and niece, caring for them like his own. Viewer discretion is advised. Maximilien Robespierre, the name strikes fear even now, 2 centuries later. For many, he's little more than a boogeyman, a figure synonymous with unchecked power and state terror. He nevertheless credited Jean-Paul with instilling in him a love of law. And throughout his life, Robespierre held the legal profession in high esteem. His father's library was filled with law books, and it was here that Robespierre spent much of his youth reading voraciously. Self-educated for the most part, he absorbed his father's collection and supplemented it with books from the local monastery, as well as pamphlets and newspapers which he bought himself. Eventually, he would read his way through every major philosophical work of the Enlightenment. But it was the social contract theory of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that proved most influential. For Rousseau, society is inherently corrupting, and the state exists solely to protect individual liberty. It is a philosophy that would color Robespierre's vision for France. But to dismiss him so, to see him only as an embodiment of the evils of the French Revolution, is to miss the nuance of a very human story. Because Robespierre was not born in fire, he was born in Arras, a quiet provincial town in northern France. In the spring of 1758, his father was a lawyer, his mother refined and reserved. When Maximilien was 5 years old, she sickened and died. His father, distraught, withdrew into himself, effectively vanishing from his children's lives. Soon after, the boy and his siblings were sent to live with relatives, which included his maternal grandfather, Joseph Gaspard, a prosperous grain merchant who remained largely apolitical until the storming of the Bastille. It was also from his grandfather that Robespierre inherited his home in Arras, a comfortable dwelling located on a street lined with trees. In childhood, Robespierre displayed signs of what would become a lifelong passion for cleanliness. Robespierre's relationship with his father was cool and distant. When he was 16, Robespierre won a scholarship to attend the prestigious Louis le Grand in Paris. Upon graduation, Robespierre returned to Artois, where he studied law under his father and established a small practice. But while his legal career brought him moderate success and financial stability, it was far from his true calling. On July 14, 1789, a mob of Parisians descended upon the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison, demanding the release of political prisoners and the surrender of the governor. In the early days of the Revolution, Robespierre played a relatively minor role. In 1792, France declared war on Austria and Prussia in an effort to prevent foreign powers from interfering in the revolution. However, despite the success of the Jacobin, the revolution was far from over. The Committee of Public Safety was a group of 12 men appointed by the National Convention, chief executive body of the French Republic, to oversee the defense of France during the French Revolution. Initially, the committee focused on preventing foreign powers from invading France. To achieve this goal, Robespierre employed a variety of tactics, including intimidation, propaganda, and terror. Despite the brutality of his methods, Robespierre was popular among many of the French people, who saw him as a defender of the revolution and a champion of the common man. At his trial, Robespierre defended his actions, arguing that he had only acted in the best interests of the revolution. There are a number of reasons why Robespierre's brutality has left such a stain on history. So there you have it, the story of Robespierre. A man whose impact on history is undeniable, but whose legacy is one of terror and tyranny. Overcrowding, poverty, crime, hunger, unrest. In the late 18th century, Paris seemed on the verge of collapse. In this series, we explore the events that sparked the American Revolution. Remember the Bastille? I'm here at the beautiful National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. But if you walk there in the early morning mist, if you stand still enough, you might just feel the weight of the stories still buried in the stone beneath your feet. They have an exhibit dedicated to the events of 1789. It's a wonderful place to explore the treasures of our shared history. In America, the Declaration of Independence was adopted the same day. Ordinary people like you and me, I think what makes the American Revolution such a compelling story is that it's really a story about regular folks, men and women trying to carve out a better life for themselves and their families. And that's a story that resonates with all of us. The letter was more than just a diplomatic exchange. It was a testament to the enduring power of ideals and the bonds forged in the crucible of revolution. In a time when revolutions were often met with condemnation and isolation, Washington extended a hand of solidarity, recognizing that the flames of liberty once ignited could illuminate the darkest corners of tyranny. But it's also a reminder of how fragile these freedoms are and the constant vigilance required to protect them. The Bastille may be gone, but its legacy lives on. If you want to learn more about the events that sparked the American Revolution, be sure to check out the exhibit. It's a fascinating journey through time. So thank you for joining me on this episode. And remember, the spirit of revolution, the courage to question, and the will to create positive change is alive and well in all of us. Till next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and above all, stay hopeful. In the cobblestone streets of Paris, and the hearts of those who dare to dream of freedom, the echoes of its fall continue to inspire generations to challenge the status quo and fight for a better tomorrow. As George Washington surveyed the challenges and triumphs of his own struggle for independence, he saw in the French Revolution a kindred spirit. Both nations were defying the norms of their time, challenging the very foundations of power and privilege. On July 14, 1789, Parisians stormed this iconic fortress, a potent symbol of royal tyranny. The echoes of that event reverberated across the Atlantic, inspiring Americans with a stirring vision of liberty and equality. George Washington, the revered leader of the Continental Army, received the news with a mixture of astonishment and cautious optimism. For Washington, The fall of the Bastille wasn't just a distant spectacle. It was a call to action. He recognized the potential for global change and the opportunity to forge a new path for America. In France, the storming of the Bastille ignited a revolution that would change Europe forever. Across the Atlantic, in a world of powdered wigs and hand-tied shoes, the American and French revolutions may seem impossibly distant. But in their essence, they are timeless. They are about courage, conviction, and the universal desire for liberty. You can learn more about the events of the American Revolution and the writing of the United States Constitution. A revolution was in the air. But across the Atlantic, another nation prepared to take its own stand. Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and self-governance fueled a growing discontent among the American colonists. And when it comes to understanding the American Revolution, you can't talk about one without talking about the other. France had its own revolutionary fervor bubbling beneath the surface. Economic woes, social inequalities, and the absolutist policies of King Louis XVI created a powder keg just waiting for a spark. A group of colonists led by George Washington were fighting for freedom from British rule. Two different countries, two different situations, two different revolutions. It's me. This is my channel. Picture it. A massive stone structure looming over a narrow Parisian street, 8 squat towers. And narrow windows barred with iron, the Bastille. By the late 18th century, it was not the sprawling fortress it had once been. It's not militarily significant, not full of prisoners, not especially threatening by practical standards. But it had come to symbolize something far more powerful, a deep and heavy shadow of royal oppression. Its name whispered of injustice, of midnight arrests, of men forgotten in cells beneath the city, of nobles who could imprison with nothing more than a signature, a letter de cachet issued by the king himself. In truth, by July of 1789, Bastille housed just 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 2 madmen, and 1 nobleman imprisoned at his family's request. Its halls were not teeming with resistance fighters. Its guards were aging veterans. Its armory was modest. And yet it became the first great target of the people. But to understand why, we must go back not to the Bastille's fall, but to the mood that hung over Paris in the weeks leading up to it. The city was dry, crowded, tense. Grain shipments had stalled. Bread was scarce again. The Estates General had met, but the king's court played with protocol while stomachs growled. Rumors grew louder than facts. And fear, quiet, directionless fear, hung like smoke. Then came the dismissal of Jacques Necker, the finance minister, who, though flawed, was widely seen as a friend of the people. His removal was taken as a sign. The king was preparing to crush the movement. In response, the people stirred, and then surged. On the morning of July 14, 1789, crowds gathered. They first raided the Hotel des Invalides for muskets, but found no powder. That, they believed, was inside the Bastille. And so a column of men and women, hungry, uncertain, armed with whatever they could carry, approached the fortress. The standoff that followed was not swift. Negotiations faltered, shots were fired, confusion reigned, smoke, screams, a cannon blast. Some of the Bastille's defenders opened fire. The crowd retaliated. By late afternoon, the outer gates were forced, the drawbridge lowered. The guards surrendered. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard Delaunay, was seized and later killed by the mob. Not on command, not with ceremony, but in that way revolutions often handle symbols, suddenly and with finality. When word spread through Paris that the Bastille had fallen, bells rang, fires were lit, church steeples echoed with jubilation. But the power of the event was never really about the prison itself. It was about what it represented and what it no longer could. Almost immediately, the structure was dismantled. Piece by piece, not just by officials, but by citizens, who took stones as souvenirs, locks, keys, chains, all sold or displayed. Even the Bastille's key was eventually sent to George Washington in America, a symbol shared between revolutions. And yet beneath the celebration, the reality was more somber. What was lost was not merely a building, but a sense of stability, even if it had been illusory. The king's power, once unquestioned, was now breached. The air felt lighter and heavier all at once, and the Bastille, both more and less than legend, sank quietly into memory. Today, the square where it once stood is called the Place de la Bastille. The fortress is gone. July 1789, a date forever linked to the fate of two nations. The American Revolution was a war fought by ordinary people against extraordinary odds. During the 18th century, European monarchies clung to power, privilege, and tradition. But in the colonies, seeds of democracy had already been sown. And that brings us back to the Bastille. At this pivotal moment, he penned a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocrat who had become a pivotal figure in the fight for American independence. Washington's letter was a beacon of support, a message that transcended geographical boundaries and resonated with the aspirations of revolutionaries around the world. You know, when you visit a place like the National Constitution Center, you see firsthand the incredible stories that shaped our nation. It's a humbling experience. Thank you for joining me here at the National Constitution Center. A lone violinist played a lively tune, filling the concert hall with sound. Aristocrats and intellectuals sat enraptured, listening intently to every note. In the beginning of another, there were some privileged few who managed to stay insulated from its effects. He lived in a grand mansion filled with exquisite art. Imagine walking through the doors and being greeted by a sight that takes your breath away. The prince reveals that despite the opulence surrounding him, he can't shake off a growing sense of unease. The outbreak of the revolution shattered the illusion of safety, forcing the prince and his family to flee. Let's move on. He continued to champion Enlightenment ideals, even in the darkest days of the revolution. For example, the wealthy and influential Comtesse de Genlis used her position to advocate for the rights of women and children. Recognizing that their voices were often overlooked in the revolutionary fervor, renowned for her elegant demeanor and sharp intellect, she effortlessly navigated the treacherous waters of the revolution, preserving her noble status while adapting to the changing times. The bustling port of Honfleur was a hive of activity. Sailors hurried to and fro, merchants bartered for exotic goods, and the salty air was alive with the energy of 1,000 stories waiting to be told. It was here, in this vibrant coastal town, that the Marquis de Lafayette had found solace after escaping the turmoil of the revolution. We'd love to hear from you in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this journey through time, we invite you to stay tuned for more captivating historical tales. Thank you for watching. Now living under the assumed name of the Marquis de Vergennes, he had managed to shield his identity, allowing him to walk the streets relatively unnoticed. Despite his efforts to start anew, however, the shadow of his former life loomed large, haunting his every step. For a while he had successfully concealed his true identity. The same could not be said for his wife, the beautiful and enigmatic Marie-Louise de Lafayette. Her striking resemblance to Marie Antoinette, the deposed queen, had become a source of constant peril, making it impossible for them to blend in with the townspeople. The couple lived in fear of recognition, always looking over their shoulders, dreading the moment when their past would catch up to them. Their quaint home in Honfleur, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a prison, trapping them behind closed doors, away from the life they once knew and the future they had hoped to build. Unlike many of her peers who clung desperately to the traditions of the old regime, the Countess embraced change, recognizing the need to adapt in order to survive. Here, amidst the bustle of daily life, the Marquise and Marchioness de Lafayette found themselves caught in the crosshairs of history, their fates intertwined with the turbulent legacy of the French Revolution. She understood that the revolution had brought about seismic shifts in society, and she was determined to not be swept away by the current. While some aristocrats like the Marquis de Condorcet and the Comtesse de Segre tried to adapt and survive, others like the Marquis de Lafayette found it impossible to escape the consequences of their former status. The revolution's impact was profound and far-reaching, leaving an indelible mark on French society and the continent as a whole. Its echoes resonated long after the fall of the monarchy, shaping the political, social, and cultural landscape for generations to come. With a keen eye for opportunity, the Comtesse opened her home to those who aligned with her vision, hosting salons that celebrated the best of both worlds, old and new. Her gatherings attracted a diverse array of guests, including members of the nobility, intellectuals, and rising stars from the middle class. In these salons, discussions flowed effortlessly from the latest fashion trends to the most pressing political issues. reflecting the Countess's ability to navigate the complexities of the era with grace. By embracing the new while respecting the old, Countess de Ségur secured her place as a prominent figure in post-revolutionary France, demonstrating that it was possible to preserve one's noble standing in an era of dramatic transformation. She hosted gatherings that brought together leading thinkers like Jacques-Pierre Brissot and Jean-Jacques. Revolutions like Condorcet, where they debated the role of women in society and explored ways to improve their lives. These salons, therefore, played a vital role in shaping the course of the revolution, serving as incubators for new ideas, and fostering a sense of unity and purpose among those who sought to bring about positive change in an era of upheaval. They offered a beacon of hope and enlightenment amidst the darkness, carrying the torch of progress and ensuring that the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity remained at the forefront of the revolutionary movement. Condorcet, along with other intellectuals, retreated to the salon of Madame de Girondin, a prominent figure in the aristocracy. There they engaged in lively discussions about liberty, equality, and fraternity, the core principles of the revolution that they saw as compatible with their own beliefs. Despite the guillotine claiming many prominent figures, including Condorcet, the spirit of the Enlightenment lived on. In the salons of Paris, these gatherings became havens for those seeking refuge from the storm, offering a space to contemplate the changing world and discuss ways to navigate its treacherous waters. However, it wasn't just about intellectual pursuits. Salons also provided a crucial social function, maintaining a sense of continuity and normalcy in an increasingly chaotic world. They served as a lifeline connecting the old regime to the new, offering a platform for dialogue and understanding between the two worlds. The journey was fraught with danger, marked by the constant threat of mob violence and the agonizing decision to abandon their beloved possessions. In the end, they were left with only the clothes on their backs, and the memories of a life abruptly ended. Rumors of an impending revolution swirl in the streets, unsettling the very foundations of his privileged existence. He voices his concerns about the growing unrest among the commoners, wondering aloud if these rumblings will turn into a full-blown rebellion against the monarchy. As he speaks, the once comforting grandeur of his surroundings seems to close in, transforming the palace into a gilded cage. The prince's predicament becomes a microcosm of the larger story unfolding across France, where the nobility grapples with the prospect of losing their power and way of life. Sunlight streams through towering windows, illuminating a vast hall adorned with priceless artifacts from around the world. Ancient sculptures stand majestically in corners, whispering tales of bygone eras. Tapestries depicting epic historical scenes hang on the walls, their vibrant colors softening the glow of crystal chandeliers overhead. The air is filled with the aroma of fresh flowers, carefully chosen to complement the rich mahogany furniture. Everything speaks of wealth, power, and impeccable taste. And at the center of it all sits the prince, surrounded by the tangible symbols of his elevated status. Each object telling a silent story of a life less ordinary. In those frenzied years, while the storming of the Bastille and the reign of terror dominated the headlines, there were also many lesser-known stories unfolding in the shadows. What did life look like for France's aristocrats during the tumultuous period? Join us as we explore how France's aristocrats lived during the Revolution when they made efforts to preserve their fading way of life. This was Paris in 1789, a city on the cusp of monumental change. Yet within these four walls, life seemed to continue as normal, and then a hush fell over the crowd as a new piece began. The delicate notes of the violin faded into the background as a deep voice cut through the silence. "Citizens," he boomed, leaning forward, "it is time to take action." His words hung in the air, electrifying the audience. This was no longer a concert, it was a call to arms. The nobleman's speech reverberated around them, echoing the growing discontent that threatened to shatter their world. For within this cultured salon, the whispers of revolution had begun. While the French Revolution was a watershed moment in European history, marking the end of an era as we begin our exploration of the lives led by France's aristocracy amidst the chaos, let's consider the intriguing case of the Prince de Guines. However, as you engage in conversation with the prince, you notice a flicker of sadness in his eyes, a hint of melancholy that doesn't quite fit the luxurious setting. The prince's home becomes a reflection of his internal conflict, a place where luxury and fear intertwine. If you find this video interesting so far, then please don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon to get notified when we release new videos. Amidst the chaos of the revolution, there were aristocrats like the Marquis de Condorcet, who refused to be cowed by the rising tide of radicalism. Madame de Girondin's salon became a hub for such interactions, attracting both aristocrats and revolutionaries who came to exchange ideas and forge alliances. In the midst of this social upheaval, one aristocrat stood out, the Comtesse de Ségur. Though she couldn't escape it entirely, she made sure her family didn't suffer the same fate as many of their peers. As we delve into their story, we discover how the echoes of the revolution reverberated far beyond the palaces of Paris, reaching even to this humble port town. The French Revolution was a pivotal moment in European history, marking the decline of the aristocratic way of life. What are your thoughts on the lives led by France's aristocrats during the Revolution?